A passport is more than just a booklet of paper and ink. It is a key. It unlocks the world, represents your identity, and holds the promise of journeys to come. But what happens when the very person entrusted to check that key, a gate agent with a little bit of power, decides to become judge, jury, and executioner? What happens when they look you in the eye and with a flick of the wrist rip that key in two? This is the story of that moment. A story of arrogance, of prejudice, and of a catastrophic mistake. Because the gate agent just tore up the passport of a black woman named Brenda, a tourist on her first trip abroad, not knowing she was actually Dr. Alani Williams, a senior FAA inspector sent undercover to tear their whole corrupt system apart. What followed was not just a firing. It was a reckoning. The file on Dr. Alani Williams's desk in Washington, D.C. was deceptively thin. Its official designation was Project Nightingale, a code name she'd chosen herself. Nightingales were known for their powerful, beautiful songs. But they were also notoriously hard to see, preferring to sing from the shadows. That felt appropriate. For 3 months, whispers had been trickling into the Federal Aviation Administration's Office of Professional Responsibility. They were quiet, disparate complaints, easily dismissed on their own. A lost luggage claim here, a missed connection there. But Alani, a woman with a PhD in aviation management and a mind that saw patterns in chaos, noticed the common thread: Gate B42, JFK International Airport, global wings, air flights to Europe. More disturbingly, a disproportionate number of the complaints came from passengers who were people of color, non-native English speakers, or those who appeared economically disadvantaged. They spoke of a particular gate agent, a blonde woman whose name they could never quite recall, who treated her counter like a personal fiefdom. They described being belittled, charged exorbitant and seemingly arbitrary fees, and spoken to with a unique blend of condescension and contempt. But without a name, without concrete evidence, they were just whispers. Ghosts in the massive churning machine of international air travel. Alani Williams was 42 years old, a veteran of the FAA who had seen it all. She'd investigated maintenance fraud, pilot misconduct, and air traffic control failures. She was respected, slightly feared, and known for her meticulous, almost surgical approach to her work. She was also a black woman who had navigated the subtle and overt currents of prejudice her entire life, from her honors program at MIT to the boardrooms of the nation's highest aviation authority. She knew the dismissive glance, the assumption of incompetence, the extra scrutiny. She knew how it felt to be a ghost. That's why Project Nightingale was personal. Her boss, a weary but good-hearted man named Director Evans, had been skeptical. "Alani, we don't have the manpower for a full undercover sting based on a handful of unsubstantiated passenger complaints. JFK is a madhouse. Global Wings is one of the biggest carriers in the world. That's exactly why we need to do it." "Robert," she'd argued, tapping the file. "If there's a rot in a carrier this big at a gate this busy, it's a systemic risk. It's not about lost luggage. It's about a culture of impunity. Today, it's bullying passengers. What is it tomorrow? Waving through a suspicious bag because they're in a bad mood. Overlooking a security flag on a document because they've already decided the person is a nuisance. She had him. The word security was the magic key in their world. The plan was simple yet elegant. Alani would shed her identity as Dr. Williams, FAA investigator. She would become Brenda Jackson, a 42-year-old social worker from Baltimore on her very first trip to Europe. a budget-conscious tourist, excited but a little nervous. Her wardrobe was carefully selected from a thrift store, slightly worn jeans, comfortable but unfashionable sneakers, a faded Baltimore Orioles sweatshirt. She tucked her natural hair under a simple wig of tightly braided cornrows. She wore no makeup and carried a beat-up backpack and a single scuffed rolling suitcase. The final piece of the puzzle was the passport. It was a genuine government-issued passport in her name, Alani Williams. The Undercover Operations Department had an unwritten rule: never use a fake ID if you don't have to. The risk of being caught in a lie was too great. The passport itself was a few years old, the corners slightly soft, the photo an unsmiling official portrait. It was perfectly valid, but it wasn't crisp and new. It looked to the undiscerning eye like it had seen better days. It was the perfect bait. On the morning of June 28, 2025, she took a shuttle to JFK, blending in with the river of humanity flowing into Terminal 4. The air was thick with the smell of floor cleaner jet fuel and fast food. The cacophony of rolling suitcases, final boarding calls, and a dozen different languages was overwhelming. It was the perfect environment for someone to feel small and powerless. She found her way to the Global Wings air check-in counter for flight GW 788 to London Heathrow. The line snaked for what seemed like miles. At the head of the premium check-in line, she saw her first target. She wasn't hard to spot. A blonde woman in her late 40s, her uniform jacket stretched tight across her shoulders. Her name tag read Karen Miller. She had a practiced plastic smile that didn't reach her cold, calculating eyes. Alani watched her for 20 minutes, observing the performance. An elderly Indian couple was struggling to understand the baggage allowance. Karen spoke to them slowly, as if to children, her voice dripping with exaggerated patience that was more insulting than outright anger. She charged them for their carry-ons with a triumphant tap of her keyboard. Next, a young backpacker with a guitar was told his instrument was a liability and would cost an extra $200 to check. He argued. She sighed dramatically and called for a supervisor. The supervisor, a man named Mark Thompson, materialized. He was in his 50s with a weary, disinterested air. He listened to Karen's one-sided version of the story, glanced at the frustrated musician, and shrugged. "She's just following policy, son. Pay the fee or miss your flight." They were a team, a well-oiled machine of petty tyranny. Alani's heart beat a little faster. This was it. The ghost was in the machine. And it was time to make some noise. After another hour of waiting, it was finally her turn. She shuffled forward, placing her worn suitcase on the scale and giving the woman at the counter a hesitant, nervous smile. "Hi, I'm checking in for the London flight," Alani said, pitching her voice a little higher, a little softer. Karen Miller's eyes flickered over Alani's sweatshirt, her backpack, her face, and her hair. The plastic smile vanished, replaced by a flat, bored expression. "Passport," she demanded, her hand outstretched, palm up. Alani handed it over. Karen took it, her thumb rubbing over the slightly frayed cover with obvious disdain. She opened it and stared at the photo. "This barely looks like you," she said, her voice flat. "It's a few years old," Alani replied politely. "My hair is different, that's all." Karen held the passport up to the fluorescent light, tilting it back and forth, as if searching for a hidden flaw. She ran her finger over the data page, her nail scratching against the laminate. It looks worn." "It's been in my bag," Alani said, maintaining her Brenda persona. "But it's valid. It doesn't expire until 2028. This was the moment. The test. A normal professional gate agent would scan the document, confirm the identity, and move on. But Karen Miller was not a normal professional gate agent. She was a gatekeeper who derived pleasure from her power. "We have standards for document integrity, ma'am." Karen said the word ma'am, sounding like an insult. "A damaged passport can be a sign of tampering." "I'm not sure I can accept this." Damaged Alani feigned confusion, leaning forward. "There's nothing wrong with it. It's just not brand new." The line behind Alani was growing, the collective sigh of impatient travelers, a palpable pressure. Karen seemed to feed on it. She looked from the passport to Alani's face, a small, cruel smirk playing on her lips. She was making a decision, not based on policy but on prejudice. She saw a woman she didn't think mattered. A woman who couldn't fight back. "It's compromised," Karen declared with an air of finality. She held the passport with two hands, her thumbs in the center. Alani's breath caught in her throat. She knew what was about to happen, had war-gamed this exact scenario. But seeing it unfold was still shocking. "Wait, what are you doing?" Alani asked, her voice rising in genuine alarm. With a sharp, deliberate motion, Karen Miller ripped the passport in half. The sound of tearing paper was shockingly loud in the momentary lull of the terminal. She tore it not just once, but twice, quartering the booklet with Alani's identity, her key to the world. She then dropped the 4 pieces onto the counter. As I said, Karen stated, her voice cold and steady. "It was compromised. You won't be flying today." "Next." For a heartbeat, there was absolute silence at the counter. The torn pieces of the passport lay on the stainless steel surface like a desecrated flag. Alani stared at them, then up at Karen's smug, triumphant face. The sheer audacity of the act was breathtaking. It was a declaration of absolute power. "I can erase you." Behind her, the man in line gasped. Did she just rip her passport?" he whispered to his wife. The Brenda persona evaporated, replaced by the cold, focused calm of Dr. Alani Williams. The nervous tourist was gone. In her place stood the investigator. "I want your name and your employee ID number." Alani said, her voice low, even, and devoid of the hysteria Karen clearly expected. Karen's smirk faltered for a second, surprised by the sudden shift in tone. "Excuse me. Your name and your ID number. You are required by Global Wings policy and federal regulation to provide it upon request." "I don't have to give you anything," Karen snapped, regaining her composure. She gestured dismissively at the torn document. "You're not a passenger. You have no valid travel documents. You need to leave my counter." "Security," she called out, her voice ringing with manufactured alarm. From a nearby desk, Mark Thompson, the supervisor, came striding over. He had the walk of a man who had stamped out 1,000 little fires of customer dissatisfaction and was bored by the prospect of another. "What's the problem here, Karen?" he asked, not even glancing at Alani. "This woman." Karen began, her voice a theatrical mix of indignation and professional concern. Presented a passport that was clearly falling apart. It looked doctored. When I informed her it wasn't acceptable for international travel, she became aggressive. I was concerned for my safety, so I neutralized the document to prevent any potential misuse. Neutralized the document. The phrase was so clinical, so perverse, that Alani almost laughed. It was carefully chosen corporate jargon to cover an act of pure malice. Mark Thompson finally turned his gaze to Alani. He saw what Karen saw, a black woman in a cheap sweatshirt who looked like she was about to cause a scene. His expression was one of profound weariness. "Ma'am, you heard her," he said. "You'll have to step aside. You're holding up the line." "Your employee has just committed a federal offense," Alani stated, her eyes locked on Mark's. "The destruction of a United States passport is a crime under Title 18, Section 1543 of the U.S. Code. I am not stepping aside. I am asking for your names and employee numbers. I am also informing you both that this entire area is under video and audio surveillance, and I will be requesting a copy of the tapes for the subsequent investigation." The mention of the specific legal code, the confident, precise language, gave them pause. This wasn't the typical screaming match. A flicker of uncertainty crossed Mark's face. Karen, however, doubled down. "Investigation? You're delusional," Karen sneered. "You'll be lucky if you're not arrested for causing a disturbance. Mark, call Port Authority." "I've already called them," Mark said, pulling out his own phone. "They're on their way. Now for the last time, ma'am. Step away from the counter." "I will not," Alani said, calmly. She carefully took out her phone, opened the camera, and took a clear, high-resolution photo of the 4 pieces of her passport lying on the counter, making sure Karen and Mark were in the background. The flash was bright and startling. "What do you think you're doing?" Mark snapped. "Gathering evidence," Alani replied. 2 Port Authority Police Department officers arrived, their expressions grim. They were used to dealing with irate passengers and were clearly not in the mood for a lengthy dispute. "What's the situation?" the taller officer, whose name tag read O'Malley, asked Mark. "This individual," Mark said, pointing at Alani, "is refusing to leave the check-in counter after her travel documents were deemed invalid. She's becoming belligerent and filming the staff." Officer O'Malley turned to Alani. "Ma'am, is this true?" "Officer, your name is O'Malley, and your partner's name is Diaz," Alani asked, reading their tags. She was cataloguing every person involved, every detail. Diaz, the younger officer, looked surprised. "Yeah. Why?" "For my report," Alani said simply. She then looked at O'Malley. "It is true that I am not leaving this counter. It is also true that this employee," she pointed a steady finger at Karen, "illegally destroyed my United States passport. I wish to file a criminal complaint against her." Karen let out a derisive laugh. "Oh, for God's sake, it was falling apart. It was a security risk." O'Malley looked at the torn pieces on the counter. He looked at Karen's defiant face and Mark's supportive posture. Then he looked at Alani, who stood with an unnerving stillness, her gaze direct and unflinching. An experienced cop can smell the difference between a hysterical civilian and someone with authority. He was starting to get a bad feeling. "Ma'am, can I see some other form of ID?" O'Malley asked, his tone shifting from dismissive to cautious. "Of course," Alani said. This was the moment of the turn, the fulcrum on which the entire situation would pivot. She reached into her worn backpack, the one Karen had judged so harshly. She bypassed the wallet containing her Brenda Jackson burner ID and credit cards. Her fingers went deeper to a small hidden pocket sewn into the lining. She withdrew a sleek black leather credential case. She flipped it open. Inside on one side was a holographic identification card with the seal of the Department of Transportation. It featured the same unsmiling photo from her passport, but below it were the words, "Dr. Alani Williams, Senior Investigator, Federal Aviation Administration Office of Professional Responsibility." On the other side was a gleaming gold badge. She didn't flash it. She presented it, holding it steady for Officer O'Malley to read clearly. He leaned in. His eyes widened. He read it again. A low whistle escaped his lips. He looked up at Alani, his entire demeanor transformed. The bored airport cop was gone, replaced by a man who suddenly realized he was standing in the middle of a very, very big deal. "Oh, hell," he muttered under his breath. He took a step back and nudged his partner. Diaz looked at the credentials, and his jaw went slack. Karen and Mark hadn't seen the ID yet. They just saw the change in the officer's behavior. "What is it?" Karen asked, an edge of unease in her voice. "Did she give you a fake ID?" O'Malley turned to look at Karen, his face a mask of stone. He no longer saw a fellow airport employee. He saw a civilian who had just made a career-ending mistake. "Ma'am O'Malley," said his voice now laced with a formal respect that was chilling, addressing Alani. "What do you need from us?" Alani never took her eyes off Karen Miller. "First officer, I need you to ensure that neither Ms. Miller nor Mr. Thompson leaves this area. They are both material witnesses, and in her case a potential criminal suspect. I do not want them communicating with anyone. Their phones should be put away." O'Malley nodded. "You got it." He and Diaz moved to flank Karen and Mark, their presence suddenly far more intimidating. "Hey, you can't do that." Mark sputtered, a flush rising on his neck. "Sir, I strongly advise you to be quiet," Diaz said, his hand resting near his sidearm. Alani then turned her attention back to the counter. "Second, I need you to secure the evidence. These pieces of my passport. Bag them as you would at any crime scene." "Consider it done," O'Malley said. Finally, Alani lifted her own phone. She scrolled through her contacts past Mum and Sister to a number labeled Kronos. It was the direct encrypted line to the FAA's head of security, a man named David Chen. He answered on the first ring. "Kronos," his voice said. "Nightingale is at the nest," Alani said, using their pre-arranged code. "The target has engaged, and we have a confirmed Class 1 violation. Destruction of a federal document by a carrier employee." There was a pause on the other end. "Are you serious?" "Deadly serious, David. I'm at JFK Terminal 4, Global Wings Air Check-in Counter. See, the employee's name is Karen Miller. Her supervisor is Mark Thompson. Port Authority is on site and has secured the scene. But I think we need to escalate this. I want the airport general manager here. I want the head of Global Wings North American operations here. And David, I want our people here. Now." "Team is wheels up in 20 minutes, Chen replied without hesitation. "I'll make the calls to the GM and the airline. I'll read them the riot act." "Sit tight, Alani. We're coming." Alani hung up the phone. She looked at Karen Miller, whose face had turned a pale, sickly white. The smugness was gone, replaced by a dawning, uncomprehending terror. She was looking at Alani at the Brenda Jackson she had tried to humiliate, but she was finally seeing Dr. Alani Williams. She was seeing the ghost step out of the shadows. Mark Thompson looked like he was going to be sick. He was leaning against the baggage carousel, his face ashen. He had backed his employee, followed the usual script, and had just walked off a cliff. The silence that fell over the check-in counter was heavier than ever. The other passengers in line were staring phones held up, recording the incredible scene. The story was no longer about a rude gate agent. It was about something much, much bigger. Alani looked at the pieces of her passport, now being carefully placed into an evidence bag by Officer Diaz. A key ripped apart, but it didn't matter. She had another key. A master key. And she was about to unlock every secret, every dirty deal, and every rotten corner of their little kingdom at Gate B42. The unraveling had just begun. The next 30 minutes were a masterclass in controlled chaos orchestrated by Alani. The check-in counter at sea became the frozen epicenter of a storm that was rapidly gathering force. Officers O'Malley and Diaz established a perimeter politely but firmly, moving the gawking passengers along and telling other Global Wings employees to remain at their stations. The check-in process for Flight GW 788 ground to a halt. Karen Miller stood stiffly, her hands clenched at her sides. Her mind was a maelstrom of confusion and fear. This was impossible. The woman in the faded sweatshirt was a Fed. It had to be a trick, a scam. But the deference from the Port Authority cops, the cold authority in Alani's voice, the mention of Kronos and Nightingale, it all felt terrifyingly real. She kept glancing at Mark, looking for guidance, but he was useless. He was staring at the floor, sweating profusely, his career flashing before his eyes. He had enabled Karen's behavior for years, enjoying the quiet life it afforded him, never having to deal with difficult passengers, because she scared them all into submission. He had seen her rip up a discount voucher once, and a boarding pass another time. But a passport. He had walked into a trap of her making. The first to arrive was the airport's general manager, a harried-looking man named Richard Sterling. He had been pulled out of a high-level budget meeting, and his face was a mixture of annoyance and anxiety. He saw the police tape a precaution. O'Malley had taken on his own initiative the frozen scene, and zeroed in on the woman in the simple sweatshirt, who seemed to be in command. "I'm Richard Sterling, the GM. What in God's name is happening here?" I was told there was a security incident involving an FAA agent. Alani met his gaze. "I'm Dr. Williams, Mr. Sterling. The incident is not just a security matter. It's a criminal one." She gestured towards Karen. "Your tenant, Global Wings Air, has an employee who appears to believe that company policy supersedes federal law. She took it upon herself to destroy my passport." Sterling's eyes widened as he finally saw the evidence bag in Diaz's hand. The color drained from his face. A passport destroyed, at his airport, on his watch. The diplomatic and legal fallout could be catastrophic. I am so sorry," he stammered, looking from Alani to Karen. "This is unacceptable. Unconscionable." "It is," Alani agreed coolly. "And I'm concerned it's not an isolated incident, but a symptom of a toxic culture that you, as the airport authority, have a duty to oversee." Before Sterling could formulate a reply, a new player entered the arena. A woman in a sharply tailored Global Wings uniform marched towards them, her heels clicking angrily on the polished floor. This was Amelia Vance, the airline's director of North American operations. She was known for being a ruthless corporate fixer, and she looked furious at being summoned from her plush office in the upper levels of the terminal. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice sharp as glass. "I was told one of my agents had an issue with a passenger. Why are the police involved? Why is my check-in counter shut down during peak hours?" She glared at Alani, sizing her up with a dismissive glance. "And who are you?" Alani let the question hang in the air for a moment, enjoying the dramatic irony. She simply held up her credential case again. Amelia Vance leaned in. Her eyes scanned the badge and ID. The anger on her face curdled, shifting through shock and disbelief before settling into a mask of pure horror. She was smart enough to understand the implications instantly. This wasn't a customer service issue. This was an existential threat. "Dr. Williams," she said, her tone utterly transformed. It was now smooth, conciliatory, and dripping with corporate panic. There has clearly been a terrible misunderstanding. She whirled on Karen and Mark. The fixer was now looking for someone to fix. What did you do? Karen flinched, as if struck. The passport was damaged. She stammered the flimsy excuse, turning to ash in her mouth. She ripped it up. A passenger shouted from the crowd that had reformed at a distance. We all saw it. Amelia Vance's face was a thundercloud. Is this true? She hissed at Mark. Mark could only nod mutely, beads of sweat running down his temples. Right, Vance said, taking a deep breath. She turned back to Alani. Dr. Williams, on behalf of Global Wings Air, I offer my most profound apologies. The employees involved will be suspended immediately, pending a full investigation. We will, of course, cover the cost of a replacement passport and offer you significant compensation for your trouble. Perhaps we can move to my office and discuss this privately. It was a standard corporate damage control maneuver: isolate, apologize, and pay up. But Alani wasn't a standard problem. Ms. Vance, let me be very clear. Alani said, her voice cutting through the air. We are long past a private discussion. Your employee did not commit a customer service error. She committed a felony, and your supervisor tacitly endorsed it. This is no longer a Global Wings internal matter. This is now an active federal crime scene. So no, we will not be moving to your office. Alani continued, her voice rising slightly so that the other employees and listening passengers could hear. This counter is now on lockdown. No one is to touch any of the computers, log out of any systems, or remove any paperwork. A federal forensics team is en route from Washington to conduct a full audit of this station's activities. She looked directly at Karen and Mark. That includes all passenger records, baggage fee, overrides, employee communication logs, and internal messaging systems for the past 6 months. We're going to be looking into Project Nightingale's initial complaints, which include allegations of extortionate and discriminatory fee gouging. At the mention of fee gouging, a visible wave of panic passed between several other Global Wings agents standing nearby. They exchanged nervous glances. Karen's face, already pale, took on a greenish tint. Her side hustle, her little cash-only for overweight bags scheme that Mark knew all about and got a cut of, the WhatsApp group chat, where they joked about it, where they called passengers marks and clowns. Her mind raced desperately, trying to remember what she'd texted, what evidence was on that terminal. It was in that moment that Karen Miller understood she wasn't just losing her job. She was losing her entire life. Just then, 3 figures in dark suits strode purposefully through the terminal. They moved with the unmistakable confidence of federal agents. David Chen Kronos was in the lead. He was a compact, powerfully built man with an expression that could etch glass. He walked straight to Alani, ignoring everyone else. Nightingale, he said, his voice a low rumble. Scene is secure. It is, Kronos, Alani replied. Targets are identified. Evidence is preserved. Chen gave a curt nod. He then turned to Amelia Vance and Richard Sterling. I'm David Chen, FAA, Head of Security. Dr. Williams is the lead investigator on this case. As of this moment, the FAA is taking operational control of this immediate area. My team will be conducting interviews and seizing all relevant materials. You will instruct your staff to cooperate fully, or we will get federal warrants that will expand our search to your corporate headquarters. Am I understood? Amelia Vance, the formidable fixer, looked small and utterly defeated. Yes, understood. Chen then pointed to Karen and Mark. Them. I want them in separate interview rooms. Now. Port Authority can escort them." O'Malley and Diaz, looking relieved to be handing off this mess to the feds, stepped forward. "This way," O'Malley said to Karen. As Karen was led away, her composure finally shattered. Her knees buckled, and she stumbled. "No," she whimpered, a pathetic, desperate sound. "It was a mistake. I was just following the rules." Please, but no one was listening. She was no longer Karen Miller, the queen of Gate B-42. She was a suspect being escorted to an interrogation. As they walked past Alani, her eyes filled with tears of self-pity, and terror met the investigators. In Alani's gaze there was no triumph, no malice. There was only the cold, hard glint of justice. The siege was over. The investigation was about to begin. And Alani knew that the ripped passport was just the first page in a much darker story. The next 72 hours were an onslaught. The FAA team, led by Chen and Alani, descended upon Global Wing's JFK operations like a SEAL team hitting a target. They didn't just investigate, they dissected. The check-in counter was taped off like a tomb, and the forensics team, clad in Molo shirts with FAA emblazoned on the chest, created perfect mirror images of every hard drive from the terminals Karen and her colleagues used. Alani set up a command post in a sterile, windowless conference room that Amelia Vance had reluctantly provided. On the wall, a whiteboard quickly filled with names, dates and arrows connecting boxes of information. Project Nightingale was no longer a whisper, it was a roar. The interviews began with the peripheral employees, the other gate agents who had watched Karen's reign for years. Most were defensive, terrified of losing their jobs. They offered practiced, vague answers. Karen was strict but fair. Mark was a hands-off manager. But Alani and her team were experts at finding the cracks. They found a junior agent, a young man named Leo, who was only 6 months on the job. He was terrified, but he was also genuinely disgusted by what he had seen. She called it the tourist tax. Leo said, his voice barely a whisper, as he sat across from Alani in the interview room. If someone looked like they didn't know the rules, or if they didn't speak English well, she'd find a reason to charge them. Overweight bag, extra carry-on seat selection. She'd tell them the credit card machine was down, and they had to pay cash. "And where did this cash go?" Alani asked gently. "Into a separate drawer in her station. At the end of the shift, she and Mark would reconcile it," he said, using air quotes. "I saw him slip her $100 bill once. He called it her performance bonus." This was the linchpin. It wasn't just prejudice. It was a coordinated criminal enterprise. The ripped passport wasn't an isolated act of anger. It was the lashing out of a predator whose routine was questioned. While the interviews were chipping away at the human wall of silence, the digital forensics team hit gold. They decrypted the employee-level WhatsApp group for the JFK Global Wing's ground crew. It was a cesspool. They found memes mocking passengers. They found photos secretly taken of sleeping travelers, captioned with cruel jokes. And they found the financial discussions. Karen Miller, 10 to 15 p.m., scored a 300 from that family with the 5 bags. They looked like they just fell off the turnip truck. Mark Thompson, 10 to 17 p.m. Nice. Put it in the usual spot. We'll square up Monday. Karen Miller, 10:18 p.m. You got it, boss. This job would suck without the perks. There were dozens of these exchanges, a detailed, undeniable record of their long-running scam. They had stolen thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of dollars, 100 or 200 at a time from the most vulnerable passengers. But the most damning piece of evidence came from Karen's own terminal search history. At 9:52 a.m. on the day of the incident, just before Alani had reached the counter, Karen's computer had accessed the internal passenger manifest for flight GW 788. The system allowed employees to see basic passenger data. Next to Alani Williams' name was a small, almost unnoticeable flag, a flag generated by the ticketing system. Alani brought the log up on the main screen in the command post. 9:52:14 a.m. User K. Miller, 48:15. Accessed flight manifest GW 788 9:52 18 a.m. User Camilla, 4815. Clicked on passenger details. Williams Alani. Passenger flag Gov rate fare. Employee. Chen stared at the screen. My God, he breathed. She knew. Alani felt a cold chill run down her spine. She didn't know who I was, she clarified, thinking aloud. But she knew I was a Department of Transportation employee. She saw the government rate on the ticket. The entire narrative shifted. Karen hadn't just profiled a random tourist she thought was an easy target. She had seen the DOT employee flag, and in an act of supreme arrogance, had decided to make an example of a fellow government worker. She likely assumed Alani was some low-level clerk, someone she could bully to prove a point that her authority at this counter was absolute, and no one, not even some DC paper pusher, could challenge her. The act of ripping the passport wasn't just malice. It was a direct and intentional challenge to the authority she thought Alani represented. She had no idea she had just challenged the very office that policed people like her. This new evidence transformed the case from criminal misconduct to a direct assault on a federal officer's credentials during the commission of their duties. The final nail in the coffin came from Mark Thompson. After 24 hours in a holding pattern with the evidence mounting against him, his lawyer advised him to cut a deal. He sat across from Alani, a broken man. He confessed to everything, turning a blind eye to Karen's behavior, the baggage fee scam, the kickbacks. Why, Alani asked him, her voice devoid of sympathy. Why let it go on for so long? Mark sighed, rubbing his face. It was easy, he admitted, his voice hoarse. Karen. She handled the difficult people. My complaint numbers went down. Corporate saw my gate as efficient. They didn't care how the sausage was made, as long as the planes left on time. I got good performance reviews. I got a bonus last year. All I had to do was look the other way. He looked up at Alani, his eyes pleading. I never thought she'd do something like this. Rip up a passport. That's insane. It's not insane, Mr. Thompson, Alani said, leaning forward. It's the logical conclusion. You fostered a culture with no accountability. You let a bully run wild. You taught her that she was untouchable. Power like that, unchecked, doesn't just stay level. It grows. It metastasizes. You didn't just look the other way. You built the monster that devoured you both. With Mark's confession and the mountain of digital evidence, the FAA's case was no longer just a file. It was an ironclad indictment, not just of two corrupt employees, but of an entire corporate culture of willful negligence. The ghosts from the machine were no longer whispering. They were screaming. The retribution that followed was not a single clean strike of lightning, but a slow-moving, unstoppable flood. It didn't just punish. It dismantled Liv's washed-away foundations and left behind a landscape irrevocably altered by the currents of justice. Each wave of consequence was more powerful than the last, a meticulously documented and publicly witnessed cascade of karma. Amelia Vance, the airline's ruthless fixer, understood that corporate survival depended on swift, brutal amputations. There was no room for sentiment or due process beyond the barest legal necessity. Karen Miller and Mark Thompson were not employees to be investigated. They were liabilities to be neutralized. They were not fired in a simple meeting. They were summoned separately to a frigid, windowless temporary office that the FAA had commandeered. Waiting inside was not a familiar HR representative, but a man they had never seen before. Global Wings Air's lead counsel from their New York firm, a man named Elias Croft, whose specialty was corporate crisis mitigation. He had eyes like chips of granite and a suit that cost more than their monthly salaries. Karen went first. She entered the room clinging to a sliver of hope that she could explain, that she could frame it as a misunderstanding, a moment of high stress. That hope died under the cold glare of Elias Croft. Ms. Miller Croft began, his voice devoid of any warmth. "You are being terminated for cause effective immediately. The cause is gross misconduct, willful violation of federal law, and actions resulting in catastrophic brand and financial damage to Global Wings Air." He slid a single piece of paper across the polished table. It was her termination notice. There was no severance, no offer of assistance. Beside it, he placed a clear plastic bag. "Your personal effects from your locker." "This isn't right," Karen stammered, her voice trembling. "I had a good record. I was protecting the company's security." Croft leaned forward slightly, his expression unchanged. "Ms. Miller, your record now includes a multi-million-dollar FAA fine and a pending federal indictment. Your protection of this company has triggered a global audit of our operations. The single most helpful thing you can do for Global Wings Air now is to sign this document, surrender your employee credentials, and disappear. Quietly." Her fight evaporated, replaced by a chilling realization of her own insignificance. She was no longer a queen in her small kingdom. She was a disposable component being expunged from the machine. Her hands shaking, she signed the paper. She pushed her ID badge across the table. The plastic card, her symbol of power, looked cheap and flimsy under the harsh fluorescent lights. Mark Thompson's experience was quieter, but no less devastating. He walked in already defeated, his shoulders slumped. He had confessed. He knew what was coming. Croft didn't even bother with the pretenders of a lecture. "Mr. Thompson, you know why you're here. Sign this." Mark looked at the lawyer, a flicker of his old life warring with his new reality. "My pension. I've been with the airline for 22 years. Croft offered a slight, cruel smile. "Your pension is currently under review by our board, pending the outcome of both the federal investigation and our own internal financial audit into the fraud you admitted to facilitating. I wouldn't be optimistic. Your badge, please." Mark slid it across the table. It was the end of his career, executed with the sterile precision of a corporate guillotine. 3 days later, CEO James Harrington stood at a podium in a stiflingly hot ballroom at the New York Marriott Marquis. The press conference was a calculated risk, an attempt to get ahead of the story. It failed spectacularly. Harrington read his prepared statement about zero tolerance and a failure of character. But the journalists were sharks that smelled blood in the water. Leaks from the FAA investigation had already started to circulate. A reporter from the New York Times stood up. "Mr. Harrington, you call this a failure of a few individuals. Yet our sources indicate that at least a dozen formal complaints, specifically naming Karen Miller for aggressive behavior and questionable fees, were filed with JFK management over the past 2 years. Were you aware that Mr. Thompson, her supervisor, personally signed off on dismissing every single one of them? Harrington's face tightened. We are conducting a full review. Before he could finish, a blogger from a popular aviation watchdog site shouted out, "Is it true your employees had a name for their scam, that they called it the tourist tax in their private messages? How can you claim this wasn't a systemic issue when they had slang for it?" The room erupted. Questions flew like shrapnel. About the cover-up, about the culture, about corporate negligence. In the front row, Amelia Vance sat ramrod straight, her face a mask of composure, but inside she felt her own career teetering on a knife's edge. She had hired Mark Thompson 5 years ago. That connection was now a stain on her record. The press conference was a disaster. The headline on Reuters the next morning wasn't about the CEO's apology, but about the airline's culture of corruption, Global Wings tourist tax scandal. Deepens as CEO evades questions. The stock, which had dipped 8%, fell another 5 points. The FAA's fine was the first hammer blow. The press release was brutal. It detailed the $175 million penalty, breaking it down $500,000 for the systemic baggage fee violations, $750,000 for the negligent supervision and failure to act on passenger complaints, and a final punitive $500,000 directly related to the unprecedented and egregious act of destruction of a federal travel document by a carrier employee acting against a known government official. The FAA had made it personal. Then came the second, more terrifying hammer. Karen was at home in her now silent condo when her newly hired, ferociously expensive lawyer called. "Karen, I have the indictment from the U.S. Attorney's Office," he said, his voice grim. "It's not good." He read the charges. Destruction of a U.S. passport, conspiracy to commit wire fraud, multiple counts of wire fraud itself. They're not playing around. Given that the victim was an undercover FAA investigator and the evidence from the chat logs is ironclad, they are going to push for jail time. Significant jail time. Karen sank onto her sofa, the phone slipping from her hand. The words echoed in her mind. Jail time. This wasn't a fine or a firing. This was cold steel bars and a loss of freedom. The same call went to Mark Thompson, with the added charge of making false statements to a federal agent. He heard the news and simply hung up the phone, staring blankly at the wall of his study. But the final, most financially ruinous blow came a week later. A courier delivered a thick legal envelope to both of their homes. Global Wings Air, guided by the merciless Elias Croft, had filed a massive civil lawsuit against them. The airline was suing its 2 former employees to recoup the full $1.75 million FAA fine plus punitive damages and legal fees, arguing that their direct criminal actions were solely responsible for the company's losses. The lawsuit immediately triggered a lien on all their assets, their homes, their bank accounts, their retirement funds. The karmic cascade now washed over every aspect of their lives. Karen Miller became a meme, a digital ghost to be mocked and vilified. Her face was on cable news, on talk shows in the Daily Mail, under headlines like "Passport Karen's Reign of Terror Ends in Federal Charges." She couldn't go to the grocery store without someone whispering and pointing. Once a man followed her down an aisle, filming her with his phone, saying, "Look, everyone, it's the passport ripper. Don't let her near your wallet." She fled the store in tears. Her financial world collapsed with breathtaking speed. Her life savings were instantly consumed by her legal defense. The civil suit meant her condo. The symbol of her middle-class success was no longer hers. She was forced into a fire sale, taking a massive loss just to liquidate the asset before the bank seized it. She moved into a dingy one-bedroom apartment in a part of Queens she used to mock. Desperate, she tried to find work. She applied for a retail job at a department store. The hiring manager was friendly until she got to Karen's name on the application. The manager's eyes widened slightly. "I'll, have to run this by corporate," she'd said. Karen never got a call back. Her name had become poison. For Mark, the ruin was quieter, but deeper. The public scorn was one thing, but the private shame was another. His wife of 25 years, Susan, confronted him in their kitchen, holding a copy of the newspaper. "I read the whole story, Mark," she said, her voice shaking with a rage he had never seen. "They called it the tourist tax. You took money from people who couldn't fight back. You let that horrible woman torment people. And when a federal agent was standing right in front of you, you lied to her face to protect your little scam. For what? For an easy life. For a bonus. Susan, Don't," she cut him off, her eyes welling with tears of disgust. "The man I married had a conscience. I don't know who you are anymore." 2 weeks later, she filed for divorce. He had not only lost his career and his savings, he had lost the entire moral architecture of his life. The final exquisite twist of the knife for Karen arrived by mail. It was a flimsy computer-generated letter from a third-party collection agency. It stated that as per their civil suit, they were collecting a debt on behalf of Global Wings Air for expenses incurred due to her actions. It was an itemized bill for Dr. Alani Williams's ordeal, one last-minute full-fare ticket to London on another airline, one emergency passport replacement fee, and miscellaneous travel disruption costs. The total was £2,845.17. Her grand act of power, the ripping of the passport, had been reduced to a pathetic, humiliating bill she had no way to pay. 6 months later, Dr. Alani Williams walked through JFK's Terminal 4, her rolling bag gliding silently behind her. She was on her way to an aviation conference in Geneva, dressed in a tailored blazer, the picture of professional authority. She paused by the Global Wings check-in counters. The change was palpable. Large, clear signs in multiple languages detailed baggage policies. A passenger bill of rights was prominently displayed. She saw an agent leave his station to help an elderly couple lift a heavy bag onto the scale, a small act of kindness that would have been unimaginable under the old regime. She saw Leo, the young agent who had spoken up. He wore the red jacket of a shift supervisor now. Their eyes met across the bustling terminal. He gave her a subtle, grateful nod. She nodded back, a silent acknowledgement of their shared role in the sea change. She got in line. When her turn came, a bright-eyed young woman greeted her. "Good morning, ma'am. Heading to Geneva today?" the agent asked with a genuine smile. "I am," Alani replied, handing over her new crisp passport. The agent took it carefully, almost reverently. She scanned it, typed a few things into her computer, and smiled again. "Okay, Dr. Williams, you're all set. You're in seat 14A. Have a wonderful flight." The transaction took less than 90 seconds. It was polite, efficient, and utterly respectful. It was normal, and in its normality, it was the ultimate evidence of her victory. The ghost had not only haunted the machine, it had forced it to be rebuilt with accountability as its new cornerstone. The cascade had finally washed away the rot leaving behind something clean, something better. The story of Dr. Alani Williams and Karen Miller is a stark reminder that a little bit of power in the wrong hands can be a truly destructive weapon. It's about more than just a ripped passport. It's about dignity, respect, and the fundamental idea that no one should be made to feel powerless because of who they are, what they look like, or where they come from. The swift and devastating karma that came for Karen and her supervisor wasn't fantasy. It was the result of one woman's courage to stand firm, and a system for once working exactly as it should to enforce accountability. What do you think? Was the karma justified? Have you ever witnessed an abuse of power like this? Let us know your story in the comments below. These conversations are important. If you believe that accountability matters and that stories like this need to be told, please help our channel by hitting that like button, sharing this video with someone who needs to see it, and most importantly, subscribing and turning on notifications so you don't miss our next deep dive into real-life drama and justice. Thank you for listening.